Oh, wow. That's right. Hello, and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today, we're going to be discussing the tragic, I don't know if conflict is the word, but crisis certainly is, in Myanmar. Specifically, the sort of troubling way that it is developing and the way that it seems to me that it looks as if it's sort of growing into a sort of Syria of the 2020s. We'll be talking about the possibilities for that. Before we get into it, just some preliminaries. If you're new here, this is live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. We start off, I'm going to do a presentation talking about Myanmar specifically, some comparisons. That'll go on for a half hour, 45 minutes, sometimes as long as an hour, but I don't think that'll happen today. And then we'll have Q&A for the next hour. So it's a 2-hour presentation with an hour of presentation. So if you have any questions, I would hold off until the Q&A period, because I'm not going to be able to respond to them. You are encouraged to interact with each other in the chat. We are very open-minded about what you can talk about in the chat. Very little censorship in that regard. You're welcome to say anything you want to say about me. My stupid face, the stupid things I'm saying. That's encouraged, in fact. You can disagree with each other strenuously. However, we do ask that you be civil to each other. Do not go after each other in the comments based on, just be civil. Be civil to each other. The discussion can be heated, but we don't like personal attacks here. Loga Cool Extreme is the moderator. If he thinks you're doing something wrong, he will tell you, listen to him and cut it out. Because if you don't, then he will either ban you for a period of time or just block you entirely. There is no court of appeal from Loga. If he decides you are not adding to the conversation, he will remove you. With all that said, I think it's time to get into that. I have been as disturbed as everyone else watching what's happened in Myanmar. There was a coup in early February where the military junta that has always run the country, since the late 80s, basically took back a lot of power. Starting in 2008 and throughout the 2010s, there was a sort of pretense, not just a pretense, it was a real attempt at democratization, but the military always made damn sure that they were in charge and they had whatever mechanisms they felt they needed to reassert their power. So there was a functioning government run by Aung San Suu Kyi, who was previously a Western darling, but has since fallen out of favor because of a genocide that the military junta committed, and she defended. There was a functioning government. The government of the NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, had been elected in 2015 and re-elected by a landslide in, I believe, November of 2020. And that provided the impetus, the excuse for the military to take full control once again. It's pretty scary stuff. If you look at the number of people who are dying, the estimates are over 500 peaceful protesters, mostly peaceful protesters, what have you, have been killed. Some points by rubber bullets, water, what have you, but some by live fire. If you want to get comparative with this, talking about Myanmar versus Syria, in this 2 months, just this 2 months of escalating conflict between protesters and the military, we've got 500 dead. That's like an eighth of all the civilians that were killed in Syria in 2011, which convinced the United States and other Western actors and primarily, I guess, Gulf actors to destroy Syria and kill 500,000 people in that country. This is what's happening here is significant. What's happening here is grim, and I do think that it is worth asking Is this the kind of situation that could end up becoming another horrific Syria type situation? I'm going to give it away here at the beginning. I don't think it could. I think there's a couple factors that make it seem unlikely, thankfully, that this would end up in a sort of Syria-style nightmare proxy war. But it's a possibility. But I think it's a distant possibility, perhaps a more distant possibility than the title of this video implies. But first, let's talk about why it is possible. Myanmar is a fascinating country that I just don't. I'm pretty weak on Southeast Asia, as longtime followers know. It's a tremendously complicated region. For the purposes of this video, I've spent a couple days really diving in on Myanmar, but I think my limitations here are gonna shine through. But I did sort of learn some basics, so let's talk some basics. Most basic is the name of the country Myanmar or Burma? What's interesting about this is, in the context of a lot of post-colonial name changes, we go from something that's sort of more generic or insensitive or outside colonizer view, and then go to something that's more authentic and more of the government and people and what have you. What's kind of interesting is with this Burma-Myanmar transition, there's kind of a contrast here. Burma, the name, I learned this just this morning, refers to the Bamar, who are the majority in Myanmar. There's apparently some controversy over the numbers. The official figures hold that the Bamar people are 68% of Myanmar's population. Somebody argued this morning it was more like just 50%. I don't know. Obviously, in a country with multiple 50-year-long insurgencies, getting appropriate census results are going to be kind of difficult. But so Burma is actually sort of the name of, is a representation of the Bamar people. And Myanmar was a new name chosen by, apparently generically means the strong or something, was a new name picked by the military junta in the 80s because it was actually a bid to be more inclusive, to say, okay, we're not just Burma, we're not just the country of the Bamars. And an interesting aspect of this is that a lot of the ethnic groups that have their own militias actually insist on continuing to refer to the country as Burma because they do see themselves as somehow separate. So it's sort of this weird thing. I'm generally kind of all about, probably to a troubling degree, an ethnically genocidal way. Degree. I'm probably generally for assimilation and whatnot. So I think at least the spirit of changing the country's name to Myanmar makes a sort of sense to me, even if it is somewhat, even if it's put forward by this nasty military junta. So yeah, that's the excuse me, that's the Burma Myanmar distinction. So Southeast Asia has had a history of just extraordinary empires. I had some friends that visited Myanmar when it was just opening up again in 2011, and I was just incredibly jealous of what they got to see. The country, I believe, is 90-something% Buddhist, and you've got 1,000-year-old temple complexes and more recent ones as well. But the place is apparently just an extraordinary place to visit, this extraordinary depth of history, and these many storied empires that I just know nothing about. It's sort of I'm getting a little bit better on India, but I just haven't made it that far east yet. Like trying to distinguish, like I'm at the barely understanding podcasts I listen to about Angkor Wat, or I just don't get Southeast Asia, but I do know that there's just extraordinary complexity here. What's an interesting aspect of those empires that used to have so much control is, of course, a pre-modern empire has a lighter footprint. than a modern nation state. And I think that's one of the real key issues for Myanmar, is that since its independence in, I believe, 1948, 47 or 48, it has had to constantly struggle with, okay, how do we incorporate this, how do we become a prosperous modern nation state when we've got such extraordinary diversity? I think that there's 54 million people, I think that's 2019 World Bank figures, 54 million people in Myanmar and 111 official languages. The podcast I was listening to on this morning, which is the War Nerd podcast, they had a recent episode on this, and I'd highly recommend it. They said that there's 111 official languages, and on the podcast, the guy they were interviewing was careful to emphasize that, yeah, that's 111 official languages recognized by the racist ethno-nationalist military junta at the center. So if even they're conceding that there are 111 languages spoken in this country, then yeah, it's an extraordinarily diverse place. With a sort of very diverse geographic area where you've got sort of some mountain regions that tend to be home to more diverse regions that were never sort of incorporated into these pre-modern empires, and then the large flatland area with the Bamar or Burmese people. So this is all very complicated. They've had this struggle ongoing since the beginning of independence, and it has never really, supposedly, the independence leader, the father, Aung San, I believe, of Aung San Suu Kyi, the woman who has now once again been arrested by the military junta, who was the elected leader of the country, attempted in very early going to build a more carefully multi-ethnic polity and identity for Myanmar, Burma at the time. But I think he was assassinated very quickly, and then there was a series of coups. So at this point we have, and this is sort of the first point that makes one very worried about the proxy war potential for Myanmar. This factor that you have multiple half-century-long running insurgencies in this country. There are already, the creation of the Rojava enclave in northern Syria is a big factor in that war. There are already multiple pieces of Myanmar territory that are physically controlled by resistance groups and have been so for quite some time. So that's certainly something that any country looking to fight a new Cold War would be delighted to sort of pour money into. Another thing here that makes one fear a civil war, or even in some ways, if I were a younger and stupider man, root for a civil war, is that this dictatorship has been in control for quite some time, and it's really hard to disagree with the proposition that the reason they're intervening now, after this 10 to 12 year democratization process, the reason that this junta is intervening now is because they see that the country is becoming happier and more prosperous and more authentically democratic under Aung San Suu Kyi, and they want to crush that. They want to stop that process. Apparently, there were people in governments everywhere fool themselves. And one of the podcasts I was listening to yesterday said that the junta, or at least certain elements of the junta, I think that there's a local name for it. The Tatmadaw is the name of the military junta. I'm just going to keep calling them junta because it's easier for me to say. The military junta that has run the country since 1988. There's some sense that they actually thought that that Aung San Suu Kyi was going to lose this election in 2020, and they're sort of a little surprised and horrified that did not happen, that was not the case. Getting into sort of the complexity here that makes me think that, in fact, this may not be a good candidate for a massive, nasty proxy war. Apparently, the Tatmadaw expected that they would be able to carve off more votes from the ethnic minorities within Myanmar, because Aung San Suu Kyi has very famously, especially in speaking up for the genocidaires, the folks who, at the very least, ethnically cleansed 750,000 Rohingya from Myanmar, and quite possibly killed thousands or tens of thousands of those people, rather than just sending them to Bangladesh, which is a technical definition of ethnic cleansing. So I guess the military junta calculated that, okay, maybe Argyle will do better with ethnic minorities since she's so enthusiastically taken credit for our crimes against ethnic minorities. That apparently did not work out. Apparently, the Aung San Suu Kyi's, I know I'm mispronouncing everything here, and I apologize. Her government won in a landslide in November. So another reason that I think that a civil war looks like a real possibility is just how unpopular this dictatorship is. I mean, the fact that 500 people, that the people of Myanmar, of these big cities in Myanmar, are willing to continue to protest against this junta after 500 people have been gunned down is pretty extraordinary, and I think makes a good case for, like, okay, this could really go in a civil war direction. Another reason where it seems like it's a real possibility is that, and the opposition to the military junta in Myanmar has something that the Syrians never had. They have a united, recognized, sort of popular leader. They have the opposition has a leader. We never had that in Syria. After 3 or 4 years of watching Syria get destroyed, I sort of came around to, it's better off just leaving Assad in power. But if the opposition in Syria had actually ever managed to coalesce around a single group or even a single committee, then I would have been, probably down with it. But all the opposition ever offered in Syria was greater chaos and probably jihadist chaos. Whereas here, there's actually an opposition figure that has been largely doing the more difficult work of governing the country for a decade in Aung San Suu Kyi. Another part that would lead to the possibility of, like, yes, there's already a civil war in Myanmar. There are multiple civil wars in Myanmar, and these are real military. These militias, there's a wide variety. There's a list I was looking at. I think there's a dozen serious insurgent groups, some of which often fight each other. But they are real militaries. I mean, they have real equipment, real potential, and that's something else that would make you think that this could end up as a real civil war of some sort, a real, like, horrifying, large-scale civil war. There's already actors, I think, taking steps that would make that more likely. I think sort of scary steps that just suggested was that there was the calls being made by, I think, actually, international diplomatic figures from Myanmar who are affiliated with the government that was just thrown out by the coup. I've been suggesting no-fly zones, and it's just like, how exactly is a no-fly zone going to work in Myanmar? It's like, doesn't seem to be fit for purpose. You're not going to have a no-fly zone over the capital city. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And the Biden administration has apparently already switched all government aid to civil society organizations. I don't know what that actually means in practice, but I do see that, and that I get real shades of Syria as well. We talk a lot in the United States about how much humanitarian aid we've given to Syria. Look, sure, we support some militias, but mostly we're just feeding people, but, like, what we're doing is feeding people by setting up government services and food in rebel-controlled areas. So it doesn't really, it's the sort of thing that bodes rather poorly. But I think in the having looked at it a little more closely, I don't think that we're likely to see a proxy war develop in Myanmar. And I pray we don't, because it would be absolutely horrific. There's sort of two reasons. There's many reasons why I don't think this is likely, but there's the minutia of the way that things work internally within Myanmar, and then there's sort of bigger picture reasons, like who would the proxies be? I think when I started looking at this, I had a fairly simple-minded approach to this, where I just sort of assumed that the Chinese would be on the side of the military junta. And I think to a degree they are, but mostly the Chinese seem to be, in this case, on the side of stability, first and foremost. Yeah, they're obviously not going to come out and be like, oh, like, let Aung San Suu Kyi go free, democracy matters. They're not going to do that, but they're also not really super excited about the fact that the Myanmar junta took this tremendously destabilizing step. So it's not quite that simple. You could definitely envision a world. There has been a world where China was more eager to support that junta. And absolutely, yes, if the United States somehow identified and found a militia that was going to support Aung San Suu Kyi and started funneling in money, you better goddamn believe that China would funnel money into supporting that junta. But it just doesn't seem to be happening on that level yet. And it's sort of the difficulty here. It gets into a broader critique of this whole idea of the new Cold War. Everybody's so excited about the idea of a new Cold War. Sorry, everybody in Washington, D.C., and U.S. media and U.S. government is very excited about the idea of a new Cold War without really understanding what the initial Cold War was. That was primarily an ideological conflict where there were two deeply opposed systems. The Soviet Union, at its core, had the belief that capitalism was ending and that its system was naturally going to be spread everywhere in the world, and it worked very hard to sort of facilitate that. There are so many desperate attempts to argue that China's doing the same thing, and they all fall completely flat. It's just not happening. I think for quite some time, Ethiopia was the big candidate in Africa. That's the thing that was following the Chinese model. Yeah, they're going to do that state-sponsored capitalism. The Chinese, supported them, gave money, gave them loans. Like this is what it's going to be. And arguably, long before they should have, Ethiopia 2 years ago all of a sudden announced, actually, no, we're going for liberal democracy and we want elections and this, that, and the other thing. Of course, that hasn't worked out for Ethiopia so well so far. But I think it's very telling that throughout the 2000s and the 2010s, the country that was most obviously trying to do the China model, sort of in a very standard, like Francis Fukuyama end of history way, decided, oh, we're more developed now. We'd like real elections now. And of course, it's an infinitely more complex story than that. But the idea that Ethiopia was going to be happy with the Chinese model is just. It is an unexportable model, and China's not trying to export it. China's trying to live in sort of like a capitalist way. So, a situation like this in earlier decades, and I think it did play out in Myanmar in earlier decades, where there was a real, like, obvious, two sides approach to go with this. There were earlier systems in Myanmar that were explicitly socialist and were supported by the Chinese for that reason. And there just isn't really, you don't have that ideological hook anymore. These militias that could be plausibly supported don't so much have an ideological axe to grind as they have an ethnic axe to grind. So it just doesn't make a ton of sense to me, the idea that that a proxy war would develop here. It just doesn't have that the same level of ideological viciousness that the Cold War did in its many manifestations, proxy wars all over every continent, really. I guess I suppose not Antarctica, but and not Australia either. I think that ideological vigor, that just sort of natural, and I think that's the thing about the Cold War that people miss. That the Soviets, at least in the initial decades, were offering an attractive alternative that also promised national liberation. That just sort of naturally, oh, we're going to have socialism, and we're going to have nationalism, and we're going to have our ethnic groups. It all sort of dovetailed together really nicely, and there isn't really that sort of logic anywhere in the Myanmar conflict. There are very serious ethnic grievances and very serious actors, but there's not an obvious way for China and the U.S. to choose sides here. Not saying they couldn't. I'm just saying it's a little unlikely. The other reason why I think that a large-scale proxy war seems unlikely is the same reason that Myanmar's had been able to have this sort of perverse stability for half a century. Yes, they have had multiple ongoing civil wars with front lines and uniformed folks on each side shooting at each other for decades. But the reason they've had that has managed to be perversely stable is that the interests of, and not universally, but the interests of, I think, the majority of these groups are rooted in a particular area. It's this sort of, there's a podcast this morning that cautioned against the stereotypical nature of these highland tribes, but I do think that for many of the militia actors in Burma, they're about sort of their independence in their enclave up a hill. And it is entirely possible for the Bamar majority and whatever other ethnic groups that are sort of in the lowland plains to have their entire political dramas that are separate. Now, because during this process, absolutely, we're seeing a spike in violence in these ongoing civil wars with ethnic groups in their sort of ethnic territories. There is a spike in violence. But the connection between the drama in the ethnic enclaves and the drama on the streets of these Bamar majority cities, where much of the sort of the most economically weighty areas of Myanmar, like I don't see the connection between those two dramas. And the thing is, unless Aung San Suu Kyi's attempt, unless everyone in the West has Aung San Suu Kyi completely wrong, and she's sort of secretly managed to do this incredibly good job of breaking down ethnic boundaries. I just don't see these ethnic groups really rallying to her standard to the extent that would be required to have a sort of concerted civil war kind of thing going. And I do. This could be just there's one qualification I do want to talk about with the Rohingya, but there's a distinct. I've completely lost track of what I wanted to say. I do want to do a bit of a distinction on the Rohingya. The Rohingya are a minority group in a nation of minority groups, but they're also sort of doubly othered, if that makes sense, or triply othered. They are predominantly Muslim in a country that is predominantly Buddhist. One of the most horrifying aspects of the Rohingya genocide was the great leaders and rallying leaders of the pogroms that murdered and forced people out of southern Myanmar were Buddhist monks. Buddhist monks out there like trying to do a genocide. And my understanding, I'm getting into stuff I've read long ago rather than the past couple days, but my understanding is that a lot of the folks in Rakhine province who are carrying out this genocide, some of them were certainly majority Bamar, and certainly the military elements that were involved in it. Many of them were ethnic Bamar, but my understanding is that local minority groups who happen to be Buddhist were joining in with Bamar in carrying out these crimes against the Rohingya. So I don't want to overstate the idea that the Bamar who support Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD would be afraid enough of the minorities, that minorities generally, that they'd be okay, that they'd eventually acquiesce to, I don't want to oversell that, eventually acquiesce to the military junta. I don't want to oversell that. I think that's a dynamic, but I think it's important to remember that just because Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD became enthusiastic apologists for the ethnic cleansing, massacres, genocide of the Rohingya, doesn't necessarily mean that their supporters are as opposed to the other minority groups, non-Bamar minority groups, who happen to be Buddhist, who happen to have more of a history of power. The horrifying thing about the Rohingya is that they've been marginalized forever. A weird thing about, how could I have gotten this far without talking about the British Empire? The British Empire used every minority group that it found, generally, to attempt to control majorities everywhere. And it's a theme all throughout the world. What was interesting about what happened in Burma was that my understanding is that they mostly ran the country with Indians, because Burma was a part of British India. Which of course doesn't make much sense if you look at modern geography or consider the nature of the population in Burma. But Burma was conquered by British India in the series of 3 wars in the 19th century, and the ruling class was of course English at the very top, but it was also Indian. And the Rohingya, in addition to being Muslim, being incredibly poor and without a historic, militia or governing group to assert its rights, also looks brown and looks like Indians. So even though the Indians who oppressed the Burmese under British India are long gone, and their descendants are living happily in Delhi, no doubt, running, no doubt persecuting Muslims, actually, running the Indian government. The poor Rohingya get the brunt of that. So I don't want to oversell. This is a long way of caveating one of the other reasons why I don't think Myanmar is a likely candidate to tip over all the way into full civil proxy war, is the same reason that the junta has managed to retain such large power, is that the fact that these civil wars have been going on for half a century kind of inoculate the country against broader civil war, or against a civil war in between the members of the Bamar majority. Because that's what we're seeing right now in the streets, is my understanding, primarily of Yangon and the other names I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, is a sort of inter-Bamar conflict with sort of the majority Bamar supporters of the NLD, the government that's been kicked out, battling with the military and police forces. So if at a point any one of these large civil wars or ethnic militias banded together to fight the military junta, I think there's a distinct chance that the NLD supporters, the Aung San Suu Kyi supporters, would sort of realize that, oh, actually, they're Bamar, we're Bamar, and we're a little more concerned about this ethnic uprising. So I think there's a number of sort of discontinuities and historical weirdnesses of Myanmar that make a broader fight unlikely. And God, I hope it stays unlikely, because this is a country of 54 million people that is also in the midst of a tremendously highly populated, complex, economically dynamic, and just it's a very important place that has certainly suffered a great deal, as has the Middle East, but has sort of in over the past half century has sort of largely emerged from that suffering. And it would be a goddamn tragedy if we found ourselves dealing with another Southeast Asia crisis on the level of the Vietnam War, which is what we'd be looking at if we had a proxy war in Myanmar. So I hope that does not develop. I think that the extraordinary belligerence of the U.S. government has not yet gravitated towards Myanmar as something to sort of fight for, and that's fantastic, and I hope it never does. So yeah, I think I've really enjoyed these past couple days, really diving in on Myanmar. It is a fascinating country. I'd love to read a book or two sometime, but I am not there yet. But definitely feel the richer having had the chance to look into it a little bit. And yeah, I really wish, I mean, it should go without saying, I really wish the military junta in Myanmar would fade away, allow Aung San Suu Kyi and her very popular democratically elected government run the place. That would be the best result for everybody. I don't think we're going to get that, and I don't think a proxy civil war is a better alternative than a victorious junta, frankly, as we've seen in Syria. I've become rather anti-revolutionary in my old age, which is sad, perhaps, but I don't know. It's just when you start imagining when the idea of running down the street, throwing rocks at somebody or potentially, God forbid, with a gun, becomes more horrifying than thrilling. I think it's a natural thing in one's 40s to become a bit of an anti-revolutionary. Who knows? Anyway, so that's the presentation. So what have we got? What have we got in the comments? What have we got? We got questions. Now, did I miss any super chats? Definitely down with super chats. Just moved into a new apartment, so yeah, I need to pay rent again, which is good. Do we have questions? What would we like to talk? We're talking about the Buddhists have kung fu. That's I don't think that's true. I think I would assume Myanmar has its own martial arts traditions. Isn't kung fu Chinese? I don't know. Let's see. Question. The NLD and the current elected legitimate government are discussing with all the ethnic armed groups to start a coordinated civil war soon, says Henry Gareth Heinlein Hitzit. I really hope that doesn't happen. But what would be ideal is if the NLD could coordinate with the ethnic groups to peacefully overturn the junta. That'd be fantastic. There's a great line from one of the podcasts I listened to. When you get people showing up at peaceful protests with RPGs, nothing positive comes from that. Saad B says, no question, I'm a big fan and love your videos. Well, thank you, Saad, with a €2 super chat. That's very kind of you to say. And thank you for the super chat. Let's see. Matt Ellman asks, how does a Myanmar civil war affect ASEAN? Is Myanmar in ASEAN? The Association of Southeast Asian Nations? Obviously it would be bad. That's sort of like the horror here is like the Vietnam War, as I'm learning more and more, not enough yet, wasn't just extraordinarily damaging to Vietnam. It was extraordinarily damaging to Cambodia, to Laos, to the sort of economic structure of places like Thailand, the ability of any country in the region to get along with any other country in the region. What's fascinating about ASEAN is that most of those countries, I don't want to overstate that, but more of those countries than you think have reconciled themselves to having a long-running insurgent base just that, like, I know Thailand's got some, I know Philippines got some, Myanmar's got tons of them. I wouldn't be surprised if Cambodia, Laos did as well. I think Vietnam probably, wiped them out, as did China. But there's a just long-standing, decades-long insurgencies in little corners of these largely, becoming more prosperous countries, and that's obviously a dynamic that I would like to see die out. Killing people is bad. Of course, these militias represent, the aspirations of peoples, but I think that they're also, to a large extent, sort of the afterglow and the after effect of Vietnam conflicts, the Cold War, and even imperial competitions of centuries back. A more enthusiastic countrywide civil war in Myanmar would encourage all of those dynamics to speed up and spin up again further. Because there are, insurgent bases within Myanmar that, I think the Thai, at least traditionally, support some insurgent groups in Myanmar, and Myanmar, provides some, or at least historically has provided some comfort to insurgent groups in Thailand. But if all these sort of old echoes of empire and echoes of the Cold War, if we got a truly hot, larger scale civil war in Myanmar, that would accelerate, that would make all of those ghosts and echoes much louder and lead to broader chaos. So yes, I do believe that a broader civil war in Myanmar would be bad for ASEAN. Keep in mind, of course, I don't know much about this region. DSM 0305 says the best possible scenario for minorities is in fact a civil war. Nothing positive will come from the Myanmar military peacefully genociding their minority. And certainly not calling for anybody genociding their minorities. And civil war is never a good thing. Mahmoud Badr says, do you think there will be a shift away from the Middle East to East Asia in U.S. foreign policy? Is this a good thing? I don't think it's a good thing. I think that, there should be a shift of U.S. policy from the Middle East to the United States. I think that's where we should be focusing our interests. I think there's a broader call for diplomacy everywhere. I think the State Department, the U.S. Foreign Ministry is called the State Department, should be more heavily funded, and we should be more interested in diplomacy and outreach everywhere. But we should demilitarize our strategy everywhere, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, everywhere. That's Mahmoud Badr. That is something that has been promised. A pivot to Asia has been promised by U.S. policymakers for about a decade now, yet we just keep doing dumber and dumber shit in the Middle East. There was the Islamic State, our proxy in destroying Assad that got out of hand. We had to deal with that, and then Trump and possibly one of his greatest gifts to China, Donald Trump decided to blow up the Iran nuclear deal, which of course means more tensions, more troops in the Middle East. So while, yeah, I think that for 10 years now, a lot of official Washington, D.C. has been trying desperately to get out of the Middle East, I think they've failed pretty miserably. And I think that failure is continuing and is likely to continue. I don't know. Though the U.S. military is now making a bid for higher and higher budgets, so it can do everything and be everywhere forever, until it causes World War III, which seems stupid. Multimeyer says the Russians are concentrating military at the Ukrainian border. Do you believe the U.S. will condemn this action? After all, they got more and more dependent on Russian oil in the last years. I don't think the U.S. I think first off, I think it's a bit of an exaggeration to say that the U.S. has become dependent on Russian oil. I mean, we've certainly been using a lot of Russian oil, which makes it deeply hypocritical that we're imposing sanctions to stop the Nord Stream 2 that would allow Germany to have a slightly different access to Russian gas. So yeah, I think the United States, I think that Putin, that would be a tremendous miscalculation on Putin's part, getting into Ukraine. I think that there are vastly large sections of the US public that are just chomping at the bit for a chance to kick Russia around. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really effective. A lot of Republicans, conservatives, are sort of been long sort of knee-jerk haters of Russia. But one of the things that the U.S. military-industrial complex pulled off really well was convincing a whole bunch of traditionally sort of more left-leaning, Democrat-leaning, anti-war-leaning folks that Russia, imposed Trump on us. So I think that if Putin thinks that Biden's going to be some kind of pushover and not interested in acting forcefully in Ukraine, I don't know. That seems like a really big miscalculation to me. But Putin might be getting to a sort of state of desperation himself as those things go. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I've seen a lot of talk about escalating tensions in Moldova, in Ukraine. I don't know how seriously to take it. I've honestly haven't been as focused on Europe as I used to be. My instinct would probably be that Russian forces are not going to enter Ukraine. Sorry, Russian forces are not going to openly enter Ukraine, is my instinct, but I could be wrong about that. But yeah, that's a great question, Malta. I should look into that more. Aditya Mohan says, I honestly think a civil war in Myanmar, which in turn causes a refugee crisis in India's northeast, would just worsen its insurgency problem there, undoing decades of progress. Great video, by the way. I agree. Thank you, Aditya. Yeah, I think I agree on that. It is fascinating, just I talk about how I don't make many videos about India because it's a whole nother world, sort of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and that border area, which is obviously right on Burma. Like it's a whole another world of complexity. It's like sort of like you've got the world where you're sort of like, okay, here are the geopolitics of Europe, the Middle East, and the United States, and this is how these work, and and that's like one set of things, and then gets a little more complex when you add in Latin America and Africa, and then like all of that is like that level of complexity of looking at the whole world is duplicated again looking at India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and its borders, and like it's just and yes, I think what was it, Matt Ellman's question, like yeah, I think the whether it would destabilize ASEAN, that's likely, but also just the chances for destabilizing Bangladesh and India are massive, and in the context of a much more nationalist Indian government that's already pretty leery about helping refugees from the east. Refugees from the east. That's a scary thing to contemplate. And also, I mean, not just to, though, I am beginning to become much more skeptical of Modi. I don't want to lay everything at his door. It is a fiendishly complex area with so many pitfalls, and India has its own long-running insurgent groups in eastern India, and sort of adding to that complexity. So yeah, it's a whole nother world. Question. Saad B says, another super chat. Thanks, Saad. Do you believe the U.S. can reform and improve domestically over the next 50 years? If I recall correctly, you described the U.S. as an empire in decline. I don't think I'm really that much of a declinist, honestly. That's what's so frustrating to me, actually, is that I'm at root kind of an optimist about the United States. Like I believe the United States has a lot to offer the world. I believe the United States has a glorious future if it can just stop doing so much stupid shit. That's the I suppose all imperial declines are self-imposed. But like, yeah, there's just no reason for a lot of the stuff that we do in the United States. I don't know, like I think what I'm 100% sure is that the United States is at sort of a turning point. One of my favorite videos I did last year was called Ronald Reagan versus the Joker. Maybe I should have been clear about what it was about, but that's sort of my sense of where the United States is right now. And I think we had the 40-year arc of FDR, that approach to government in the world that was tremendously successful, beat the Nazis, among many other things. And then it sort of lost steam. And then you had the Reagan view of the world that sort of, probably peaked at some point before 2008 and is now completely run out of steam in the personified by Donald Trump. And the question is, what's next? Like, if we continue beating this dead horse of Reaganism, or Trump gets back in office, or yeah, I mean, it's easy to imagine the United States continuing to spin off into sad decline and it being kind of a joke. But it's also easy to imagine, like it's fascinating, is just how grim most people's view of the United States and its prospects were in the 1970s, just being like, oh yeah, like we just lose everywhere. And the Soviets are on the march and the Japanese are taking all our car factories and it's over, we're just living in this world where, well, yeah, we used to be a big deal. And then, by the 90s, it's like the United States is the most powerful country that ever has been. So yeah, I think there's a lot of material for renewal in the United States. I think there's a lot of I feel bad sometimes, with such an international audience. I mean, I'm very flatly jingoistic. I think the United States does an extraordinary amount of evil, stupid things, but also I think there's a lot of things that make the United States unique and a uniquely positive force in history and the world. Sort of less obvious now that we're not fighting against. But keep in mind, for most of U.S. history, the alternative to the United States was, inbred European royalty or the fucking Soviet Union. That's why we're so desperate to make, the authoritarian Chinese the excuse for all the nasty things we do. Because we desperately want somebody, to be the big bad guy. And I think that what's weird now about the world now is that most of the world isn't run by people with worse systems than the United States. They're just poorer systems than the United States, and the U.S. is often complicit in keeping those systems poorer than the United States. So it's a sort of a weird thing in U.S. history since the fall of the Soviet Union, where we're not really under any plausible story, the good guys anymore. And I think that that should prompt a recalculation where we actually try to be the good guys again. And I think that's a possibility. I think that's a distinct possibility. I apologize if all that seemed very, oh, say, can you see? Super U.S. super patriotic, but I am. I don't think the U.S. has to be in decline. As a absurd belligerent neocon, I think Charles Krauthammer, who said, decline is a choice. I would argue that the choices that Charles Krauthammer advocated were most often pushing us towards decline, but we don't need to. We really don't need to, get into a war with Iran that leads to a larger war in Asia and Europe. We don't need to do that. That's still very possible. I would argue even a likely possibility, but there's nothing that says we have to do that. And even if we do that, maybe that'd be exactly the kick in the ass that the United States needs to sort of realize, oh, wait, like all this military stuff is a fucking waste. Let's just focus on ourselves for a couple decades and come back even more powerful, and actually maybe positive influence again. I don't know. But yeah, I hope that was helpful and didn't cause anybody to unsubscribe. Questions. Abdul Rahman says, you mean the Naga Hills? I think that's in India. I was talking about. But yeah, as I said, I just don't know shit. I just don't know shit about South Asia, Southeast Asia. It's all. I've read books. I've read probably a dozen books on that region at this point, and man, it's there's just so much there. Good video, thanks. Russia question. This is Laxi Stew. How might Putin leave office, and what happens then? I am not a Kremlinologist. I couldn't speculate as to how Putin would leave office. It's tempting at this point, as we're rounding 20 years of him in power, as the Putin, whether through natural or unnatural means, strikes me as the most likely thing would be that he would leave office in a coffin. I think it's entirely plausible that he could end up being a dictator for life, quite literally. But that's not necessarily what could happen. There's any number of things that could happen. From an election that by some miracle ended up being more free and fair than we've come to expect, and he was unpopular enough to lose. That could happen. I don't know if that's likely, but it's very plausible. And I think it's become a cliche at this point, but I think it's very, very true. This assumption that Putin is, if only we got rid of Putin, everything would be better. I don't think I'm breaking any new ground by telling you that ain't the case. Famously, Navalny, I think I talked about this in a patrons only news chat. Like figures like Aung San Suu Kyi and Navalny is also a similar one. People have been trying to take him down or cancel Navalny. This is the now jailed dissident who's an opponent to Putin. People want to cancel him because he's also happens to be a hyper nationalist with now disavowed but some more racist leanings. But I obviously do not think that's appropriate. We have to understand that with Navalny, with Aung San Suu Kyi, like they have to take positions or maybe legitimately believe positions that we wouldn't necessarily agree with in the enlightened West or what have you. But that shouldn't, the fact that these figures aren't perfect shouldn't make them the enemy. We shouldn't, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of an improvement or what have you. Just because Navalny or Aung San Suu Kyi are not perfect does not mean. Yes, Putin. Oh yeah. So yeah, with Navalny, that thing, like, yeah, people have pointed this out to the point where it's been a cliche. Yeah, he's a hyper nationalist too. Like he would also like all of Ukraine back. That's what Navalny is. So, and I think this is not something we run into with Turkey a lot, though actually I think in Turkey's case, like it would be better. But this idea that whoever is going to come, is you got to untangle to what extent is, this belligerence on the world stage a factor of who in particular is in power, and to what extent is it just the national interests? I guess, unfortunately, I guess you could say the same thing about the United States. Biden has so far famously failed to be much of an improvement or difference from Trump when it comes to foreign policy, because unfortunately, a lot of the things that Trump did sort of were national policy or what have you. So I think I'm petering out a little bit there. So I'm going to move on. Man, I've got a whole nother hour of Q&A, which I'm very excited by. It's been a while since I've done this. My God. It's taking a little more out of me than I'm used to. All right. Where were we? There was a super chat that I have almost missed, but I have not missed, from Alan. The crises in Libya might seriously be over, and the country's taking Tunisia's path. Embassies and companies are returning. Have you read about it? I feel like it's a little premature to say that, Alan. I will say that what I have seen in Libya has been a lot more hopeful than I expected. I did not realize that the defeat of Haftar was going to be quite as positive a thing as I thought it would be. With the encouragement of Donald Trump in it was the spring of 2019, the strongman of the east of Libya, saying that is a little misleading. On the map, it looks like he controls the vast majority of Libya. But in Libya, the vast majority of people live on the coasts. So even really, Haftar wasn't, the strongman of the east. He was the strongman of a couple cities in the east. And he was heavily funded by the UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia to an extent, and somehow managed to get Donald Trump's endorsement as well. That strongman attempted to conquer all of Libya, got disturbingly close because it was also supported by Russia and France. And then Turkey jumped in and basically broke his offensive. And I had sort of assumed that, well, okay, Haftar was going to go lick his wounds in the far east of the country, and we're just going to end up with, the majority of the people on the minority of the space of Libya, under the government of national accord, trying to figure stuff out, and then, Haftar and his puppets assembly over in the east, and then we're constant division. That's not what happened. I was wrong about that. And Alan is absolutely right to point out that really hopeful things are happening in Libya, to the extent that both the real problem with Libya was that in 2012 there was an election that put together like a government, and then in 2014 there was an election that put together a government, and the 2012 put together government refused to give up to the 2014 government. So the 2012 and the 2014 government had a civil war, and then the UN came in and put together another government, I think in 2015. Which did actually, I think the 2012 government did dissolve itself into the 2015 government, but the 2014 government out in the east that became the Haftar puppet decided not to. So my real fear was that, okay, so we're going to get another government of national unity under UN auspices, and we're going to have the 2021 government and the 2015 government, that's really the 2012 government, and the 2014 government. We're going to have three fucking governments. But so far, that seems not to have happened. The 2015 and the 2014 Libyan governments have both officially signed on to a unity government that is supposed to be organizing elections in December of this year. I don't buy it because just of how badly things have gone in Libya for so long. But it could be, it could be that with the wholehearted support of the Turkish government and also just the Libyan people broadly, even in the militias that are profiting from this chaos, are just fucking sick of what's going on. So yeah, I mean, Alan is right. Like, I think that the crisis in Libya looks pretty good, and I should maybe maybe do a video talking about that. Actually, it's been, man, I got to do an Algeria video, I got to do Tunisia video, I got all these freaking Sudan videos I'd always meant to do and haven't done. A lot of videos I need to do, but yeah, like a positive Libya video probably be a good thing, Alan, and I can further look into. I mean, I don't know, like, are we really to the point where companies are returning in a big way yet? It seems premature to me, but I would love it if that was the case. It would be fantastic if we were finally getting to stability. I really love the idea of Libya taking a Tunisia path, just as Tunisia, is looking more and more shaky. That might be a Tunisia video. Just hold on, because poor Tunisia has been democratic for a decade now. Has been a functioning Arab democracy for a decade now, and is of course dramatically less popular than the dictatorship was. Because with the dictatorship, for its whole existence, it got to live in between Algeria and Libya, two stable stable and wealthy petrostates. Since 2011, they've had this, one of them has been dissolved in civil war. And in Algeria, since 2014, the oil price has been cratered, which is a problem for Algeria as well. So through no fault of its own, the Tunisia democracy has basically had a terribly, terribly shitty economy to deal with. So it's kind of unpopular. It would be fantastic if we could get like an arc of real democracy in Northern Africa. That would be really freaking cool. And I should totally make a video along those lines, Alan. That's a great idea. But I am skeptical of the idea that um, we're really all the way through in Libya. I'd love it. I'd love it. I'd love it. I'd love it. Okay. Katari Shigusumoki Rochi Ponoma Basho says, I apologize for pronunciation. Question, Rob, what do you think of Peter Zeihan's assertion that the U.S. will essentially slip into isolationism 2.0 soon? And this will radically destabilize world trade and politics. Man, Peter Zeihan, people love to talk about Peter Zeihan, and I understand why, because he is compelling. He gives great talks. He's iconoclastic. He, he's like, he dismisses things in really amusing ways. I admire his approach to things. I have a lot to learn from him. I think as a public intellectual, dramatically more successful than I am. But I think he's really, the way he looks at things is dramatically oversimplified. I think there's a lot of weaknesses to the way that Peter Zeihan looks at the world. There's some strengths too. I think I'm somebody who does not believe that China is anywhere near as powerful as advertised by the Pentagon or the Chinese Communist Party yet. I do not believe they're that powerful yet. I do not believe that they are as threatening as advertised yet. I do not believe that. And it's usually if I'm talking about like a geopolitics analyst, I'm usually 100% in Peter Zeihan's camp because I'm like, it's ridiculous the way that you're overselling this Chinese threat. However, I would say that that Peter Zeihan goes way further in the direction of China's not a threat than I would. Like, I do believe that like the 21st century is going to be about competition between the United States and China. Like that makes sense to me. And the coalition, I don't want to minimize, and the coalition of allies that each of them is able to construct, because that coalition of allies will be much more important than it was in former conflicts, because we actually do have, God, I don't want to sound like Thomas Friedman here, but we do have not a more equal world, like a world is flat, but we have a world where the arenas are not as easily flattened by the Soviets or the US or by the European imperial forces before them. You can see that with Africa. In the 19th century, the Europeans were able to just rampage in there and knock everybody over. In the 20th century, the US and the Soviet Union had to sort of compete, within each country with, the factions that they supported, and you couldn't just set up an empire anymore. In the 21st century, China and the United States are actually going to have to make like real trade deals and concessions and whatnot, like with real national actors in Africa. So that's the trajectory that I think is going on. But the broad coalitions, the broad competition, I think still will. It won't be like the Cold War, where it's just really like, the US versus the Soviets and just killing everybody in the way. Like, it's going to be where like there will be competing blocks, and the US and China will be the most important of those blocks. There will be competition between them. That will be one of the defining factors of the 20th century. Peter Zeihan really just thinks that China's a paper tiger. It's going to blow away because on all of history, China has never been unified for more than 100 years. I think Zeihan, so a lot of what he says is really interesting, and I think it is a good corrective to the way a lot of people look at this competition. But it is, I think I've dealt with this enough times that I think I put it in comments. Like, there's the two biggest problems with Zeihan are oil and gas. I think he comes from Stratfor, which is a Texas thing. He's spent his entire life, I think, probably doing consulting work for oil and gas companies, strategic stuff. And I think, as with a lot of people in that industry, He sort of believes that renewables don't mean anything, that solar and wind are just a stupid, and electric cars, that's all just sort of a stupid pipe dream, and that's meaningless. And what really matters is oil and gas, and the fact that China is dependent on other people for their oil and gas means that China is just going to fall apart, and it needs the United States for everything. Da, 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 da. That's one aspect. And in Zeihan's defense, that's been true of renewable sources for all of human history, or all of the 50, 60-year history when we've been talking of renewables until about 2015. And the thing is, like, that's really changing and really changing rapidly. And I don't think Zeihan has incorporated that into his analysis yet. And once he does incorporate that into his analysis, he's gonna be like, oh, wait a second, like, fuck, like, actually, like 20, 30 years from now, like, China's gonna be just fine, and kind of self-sufficient with wind, sun, and the mountains and mountains of coal that they have. Like, that'll be enough. And this idea that China's just going to dry up and blow away if the U.S. Navy stops guaranteeing oil lanes, like, that's just not true. And I think there's three things. He's too close to oil and gas, doesn't understand that. Second is history. He just does not understand history. I think he's got an interesting grasp and an interesting interpretation on the United States. I think he very accurately puts the United States at the center of the imperial story since World War II. It should be at the center of the imperial story before that as well. From basically, it was a U.S.-run system from 1917 on. The U.S. just didn't choose to run it. But before that, he doesn't understand anything. He doesn't understand that actually the system before 1917 was a British-run system, to the same extent that the system since has been a U.S. system. He has this idea, before 1917, it was all forever. It was empires competing, and sort of he draws some silly lessons from that. Also, not understanding history and the incredible importance of the Industrial Revolution, the way that it changed absolutely everything. It was the Industrial Revolution that made a worldwide empire or a worldwide system possible. That's why the British were able to do what they did, and why the U.S. was able to follow sort of directly in their footsteps. That's something that I think Zeihan misses, and that's why his looking at Chinese history and being like, China was never unified for very long, and it always falls apart under its own weight. Yeah, well, you could never have a country the size of the United States before the Industrial Revolution either. You could never have a country the size of modern Russia before the Industrial Revolution. You could never have empires like the British Empire or the French Empire. It just didn't. It wasn't a possibility, and we're living in a very different historical era, and I don't think Zeihan really quite grasps that. That's another thing that Zeihan gets wrong. And the third thing is just contempt. It's kind of funny, and I think it's part of his appeal, actually. But he really just seems to have a real contempt for anybody in the world who's not American. And I think it really comes through in ways that are offensive to me. But I think can also, just it's fun to be like, fuck everybody, America first. There's a reason he gets a lot of, it's this idea that, and I think he's not wrong about the centrality of the U.S. to the current world system. Absolutely not wrong about that. But his assumption that the whole world's just going to fall apart without the guiding hand of the United States is wrong. I think that China, everybody in the world has reserves of strength and power that means that they will mean something without the U.S. World system. And I don't think Zeihan's assumption that we're going to fall into I don't think that Zeihan's assumption that we're going to fall into isolationism again holds much water. I just don't see it. Like I would love to see us backing the fuck out of the Middle East, militarily speaking, but that doesn't mean we're going to stop policing sea lanes. It doesn't mean we're going to stop. We're going to back off of our banking and financial hegemony. I see zero indication of it. Just as one example of things that Zion gets wrong, at the beginning of the COVID thing, sort of when I was listening to a lot of his podcasts, he was like, all right, this is it, here we go. Like the whole supply chain, like China's fucked now, like all the supply chains coming back to the United States. That's what's happening right now. Everybody's doing industrial policy, like it's all like that. It's happening as we speak. I've, my contacts, it's happening, This is, March, April, May, June of last year. Well, here we are in March of 2021. China's had one of its biggest export years ever, largely on the back of the United States CARES Act, in fact. It turns out like this much ballyhooed end of globalization, end of dispersed industry. It's just not happening. I think like to an extent it is, for sure. Like, yeah, like it does look like we're going to shift some factories to Vietnam, or but some of that is mostly just stuff that was happening already because China moved up the value chain and doesn't, it's not the cheapest place to make the dumbest stuff anymore. Like I think there's a lot. I think Zihan provides a very useful corrective to a lot of insane paranoia about China, but I think he goes too far, and I think he's got sort of a real contempt for the national aspirations, the national capabilities of not just the Chinese, but really everybody in the world who is an American, and I find that distasteful. I can totally I'm probably just gonna grab that and put that out as Peter Zihan, a critique. That's a video that could probably do pretty well. I mean, hey, channel's not doing that well. Might as well start a what's the word? With the rappers, what do the rappers do? Feud or something? Yeah. Anyway, that said, I think Peter Zihan's a really interesting guy, and I think he makes geopolitics interesting and fun. And he's also a heterodox thinker, which is something we desperately need more of. And it's nice to see a heterodox thinker, as I think of myself as, being more broadly successful, which I am not. Anyway, okay, talked about that for a long time. Were there any super chats? But yeah, I get a lot of questions about Peter Zihan, so I think it was worth dedicating that much time. Also, okay, questions. I did not miss any super chats. Multimeyer says, nah, Navalny's all right. Yeah, no, exactly. Navalny's all right. Morari says about Libya, that crisis is far from over, believe it or not. People will remain between power struggle for the coming years. That does sort of tend to be where I'm at. That's interesting. Local Cool Extreme says, as someone who's been to Russia, I doubt Navalny would be popular enough to beat Putin in a fair election. Putin's popularity is legit for the most part. I think that's true, but I think it's also fading to an extension. Okay, questions. Local Cool Extreme asks, is the U.S. successfully defeated Haiti junta in 1994? Can it do it again in Myanmar? Jesus, Logo. Haiti is, man, I just read this book, Empire's Workshop by Greg Garland. Maybe it's like a little too leftist, but while I'm sure he's, more down on the United States than is perhaps fair, what he described is pretty, the details of each data point might be a little different. They might not necessarily have the terrible spin that he put on everything. But man, like the story he tells of what the United States has been doing in our hemisphere is just horrifying. Like, it's just like, I mean, it can't be quite as bad as he described it, but it's probably mostly as bad as what he described it. And the sort of I think like as a literary device, he just sort of, I think he starts his description of our horrific 20th century with Haiti and then ends it with Haiti. Because I think in 1914, we actually went in, I talked about this in one of the videos where like we we sent the Marines into Haiti to literally rob their central bank, take all of its gold, and bring it back to the United States. It's just amazing how evil we've been to that country, which is one of the more inspiring countries in the world, by the way. It was the slavery was abolished in Haiti because these slaves rose up and destroyed it. It's a truly incredible story, and then a really horrifying story of how the French, the U.S., the British just abused them for centuries following. But Haiti, Loka, is a small, poor Caribbean nation in our backyard, militarily speaking. So yes, I don't think it was a serious question. Yeah, so our ability to overthrow the Haitian junta is obviously going to be dramatically more present than our ability to overthrow a junta in a country of 54 million with a large-scale, serious military on China's border. So yeah, I assume that wasn't a serious question. DSM 0305 says, do you think the U.S. should leave Afghanistan before May, despite increasing attacks by the Taliban? Yes, I think we should just get out. Just go. I think that Afghanistan, after we leave, is almost certainly going to fall to the Taliban or some kind of civil war thing. And then 5 to 10 years after we leave, it'll be whatever it'll be. It'll be more stable and more extant than it'll be something that is a real country and an independent one. However, if we stay, we can continue in this Twilight Zone horror in Afghanistan for decades to come. Decades. I'm actually beginning to wonder if Trump wasn't our last chance to get out of Afghanistan. Yeah, who cares? Of course, the Taliban attacks are increasing, and it's the idea that we're doing anything worthwhile or are capable of bringing real peace and stability to that country strikes me as a fantasy. Not that I don't think we could. Like, I think we could. Like, I think we could probably, like, if we actually made it a national priority, we could spend, another $3 trillion, like, build some serious permanent military bases, hell, colonize, settle the place, like we could, but why the fuck would we spend, $5 or $6 trillion that way? Seems like a complete waste of money. Anyway. Questions. Oh, there was a super chat from Alan. Thank you. CA, John Comrade or Khan Comrade? What are your thoughts on Noam Chomsky? It's funny. I used to be so snide about Noam Chomsky. I think most folks know, I was a big supporter of the Iraq War in my early 20s. One of the reasons that I sort of launched this YouTube channel, or has become one of the reasons that I run this YouTube channel, is my tremendous guilt over being sort of a unthinking supporter of the U.S. empire / war machine in my 20s. So yeah, I used to be like, fuck Noam Chomsky, fuck him, like having never actually read anything he said or looked at anything he said. But yeah, Noam Chomsky, I think like any public intellectual, any public figure who's been in the public eye for 50, 60 years, dude's 90 and apparently still answers every email. Like, anybody out in this chat can send Noam Chomsky an email and he will respond to you, which is just amazing. And I think he's famously, didn't he defend the Khmer Rouge or something? That used to be one of my favorite talking points when I was a little militarist. But no, on balance, he's been, absolutely right about everything. He's I'm sure there's stuff that I dispute. I'm sure there's stuff I disagree with. I'm sure he's got interpretations that I would still think go too far. But no, he's like Zion. He's obviously on a completely different scale from Zion, but he is extraordinarily courageous contrarian who has, for decades, and in decades when it was a much more dangerous thing to do, has stood up against U.S. empire for his entire career, and it's inspiring. It's extraordinary, and you know, may he live another 30 years and continue answering everybody's emails and going up and giving speeches. I mean, unfortunately, I mean, he's in his 90s. I think he gave up. He moved from Boston to Arizona, and he's probably, if you look at any recent interviews, which he is still giving and still seems completely together mentally. You know, he's still at it, which is pretty extraordinary, I think. Oh, I got another super chat from we have from Christopher Murtaugh. Thank you. Not at all a fan of forever wars, but isn't there something sane we can do to save Afghani people from Taliban returning to power? Yes, move them here. Anybody who, you know, we paid, anybody we set up, anybody, you know, it's why the United States has so many great Vietnamese restaurants, is because of the people we took, the refugees we took from Vietnam. We should take everybody who wants to come from Afghanistan, and that, God knows, we owe that country that much. Is a, you know, incredibly open refugee policy. That's what we can do for the Afghani people. But yeah, beyond that, no, nope. We're not helping the Afghan people by being there longer. Yeah, I just don't. Yeah, I mean, so because the logic there, Christopher Murtaugh, is it's like, look at this incredible, delicate, vulnerable structure that we have created. This is sort of that Afghan public that, you know, does support the U.S. and you know, supports being a better country than the Taliban. It is a constituency that we have created at the cost of trillions of dollars. And the fact that after 20 years and trillions of dollars, that constituency still needs us to be there does not. It's a, what is this, self-licking ice cream cone? Is that, it's the famous metaphor for the military-industrial complex? So yeah, I don't think it's a good. Just don't think it's a good thing. So yeah, like, I'd be very happy to welcome anybody who wants to come to the United States. Of course, we're not going to do that, but that's what we should do. I also don't think we're going to leave Afghanistan. Honestly, I'm beginning to wonder if we're going to leave Afghanistan in my lifetime. That's sort of where I'm at on that. Okay. The Sunny 3333 says, the protests of farmers in India. What do you think? I don't know. I have listened to a couple NPR broadcasts on the protests of the farmers in India. I have become very suspicious of Modi. As Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, it seems that he's not doing as much for the economy as promised, and is doing all kinds of hyper-nationalism that is disturbing. I mean, debatably, I need to look into it more, that, you know, Narendra Modi's nationalism is debatably what India's been missing. Like, is that why India sort of failed to be so economically gangbusters as China was? Has India historically been too rooted and, oh, you know, we're above all this nationalism stuff because, you know, we're so spiritually fit and poor? That's an interesting question that I don't know. Specifically, this reform with the farmers. I think there's probably a neoliberal case that the Indian government is making, saying, well, actually, it's better and more efficient this way with the new reform. And you know, I'm historically vulnerable to those kinds of explanations. But man, really, like, honestly, I just don't know. But I will say that I am getting more and more suspicious of the Modi government. And I think actually Freedom House, which is surprising because isn't Freedom House like sort of a largely seen as a U.S. intelligence community offshoot, downgraded India's sort of rating for freedom and whatnot, and that's never good. That ain't a good thing. And the way that media and government have been treating this farmer protest is an indicator of that. So yeah, but again, India, too complicated. Got to read like another dozen books before I can say anything seriously about that. Christopher Murdoch says, oh, we totally made this mess, but there's not sane investment that we, NATO, et cetera, can do to help. No, I really don't think, honestly, I don't think that there is sane investment that NATO, et cetera, can do to help at this point. I think the best thing we can do for that country is leave, just as it was for Vietnam. Um, but yeah, I don't know. Questions. Logan Coach Sim says, will Bolsonaro successfully overthrow Brazilian democracy in a successful autogolpe? Man, I don't know about that. I was talking with Loga or on Twitter earlier this week. Was it 2-3 days ago when I was like, okay, are we doing Brazil or are we doing Myanmar? And I decided to do Myanmar because what's happening in Brazil is just it's too new. I haven't looked at it today or as enough yesterday. I was decided to go for Myanmar. But my understanding is that Bolsonaro, who's failed miserably, endorsed by The Economist. One of the things, as I've learned more about Latin America, so I love The Economist. I'm a subscriber to The Economist. One of the nicest things about finally having my own apartment again was there was a place for my Economist subscription to come. But one of the fascinating things is just learning more about Latin America, as I have because of, well, in part because of Scott Locke's a very vocal viewer of this channel, but focusing on The Economist, focusing on Bolivia, Venezuela, because we've had to, and now Brazil. It's just realizing like The Economist has awful politics. Oh my God, like it's really just it's extraordinary. Like if anybody's they're like the Economist is like the last bastion of the Cold War. If anybody in the country, in the world, is even vaguely like left leaning, like the editors of The Economist want to like murder everyone in that country. It is extraordinary. And they fucking endorsed Bolsonaro, who, Bolsonaro coming to power in Brazil, the standard thing was like, oh, he's the Brazilian Trump. Yeah, well, okay, but he's the Brazilian Trump, like, who's actually probably participated in death squads and is an advocate of dictatorship. And also is just really terrible at his job. Like everything about Bolsonaro's regime was crap. And then COVID came around and it just became nightmarishly bad. Brazil is, because the United States was rich enough to develop a bunch of vaccines, we are no longer the poster boy for the worst COVID reaction in the world. Brazil probably is, and as a large place that has vastly more people suffering from COVID than it should, it's also becoming a place where it's mutating and getting worse. Anyway, it's tremendously horrific. And Bolsonaro is losing what little popularity he has. God, I even think The Economist is embarrassed about supporting Bolsonaro nowadays. How was I going to say? He's still he knows he's shaky, his popularity is plummeting, so he's making moves to try and control the Brazilian government and quite possibly doing, as Loga said, do an autogolpe. It's pretty horrifying that there's a distinct chance of Brazil falling back into dictatorship. I believe it was 66 to 85. I don't know. In between the 60s and the 1980s, Brazil had a really nasty right-wing dictatorship that Bolsonaro has always idolized. What's interesting is that it seems as though he's having trouble. Bolsonaro is very Trump-like in that he's bad at everything and is having a lot of trouble bringing about this coup. He fired a whole bunch of his ministers, including the Minister of Defense, which looked like a preliminary step to an autogolpe, to a coup. And then the heads of all the military forces who would have been carrying out his coup resigned as well. So that's where it was the last time I looked at it, 48 hours ago. And I don't know what developments have happened since. It's kind of fascinating in that it seems like Bolsonaro wants to finally throw a coup, and even the militaristic and right-wing elements of Brazil are kind of like, you know what? Maybe let's just try and run against Lula, huh? Let's maybe if Lula wins, we'll do a coup. This is the famously successful left-wing president who was then unfairly kicked out of power on corruption charges that were subsequently shown to be fraudulent. and jailed on corruption charges, subsequently shown to be fraudulent, and is also favored now that he's been exonerated to win the election next year. Yeah, so it seems like even the most right-wing and militaristic elements of Brazil aren't particularly excited about a military coup with Bolsonaro as the standard bearer. That's my sense. I don't know that much about Brazil, mostly because I've just never had the time to look into Brazil. I don't think it's that complicated. It's just super corrupt and big, and of course beautiful. And but yeah, I just don't know much about it. But that's my read on what's going on in Brazil. James Cook says, "You are right. The Economist is cancer." Well, I mean, I am very torn on The Economist. As I said, I am a subscriber because there's an incredible depth of coverage that you just don't get anywhere else. Like when I look at any country in the world, like I don't, when I think of any country in the world, like obviously I'm going to have to do a couple days of research before I'm going to try and do a presentation like this, or let alone a produced video. But in my head, I have the mental furniture with most countries in the world, not with all of them. There's probably I don't have it for Burkina Faso or really Laos, actually, either, or Paraguay and Uruguay. No, Mujica. I remember Mujica from Uruguay. But I have a sort of mental furniture in my head where I'm like, oh, yeah, like that's the place where this happened and that happened and this happened. And the only reason I have that mental furniture is because I've been a religious reader of The Economist for like 25 years now. And, because they really do they try to cover things in more depth and with more, complexity than most anybody else does. So I kind of love it, like every week they've got, this is what you should probably know in Middle East and Africa. This is what you probably should know in Asia. This is what you probably should know in the Americas. This is what you probably should know in China. And it's like, it's fascinating and it's useful. And it's like somebody's actually thinking about stuff. But as I get older and older, and as I read more books, I begin to realize just like what an incredibly skewed story of the world they're presenting. And I mean, they don't lie about it. Like that's one of the nicest things about it. What makes it so much fun to read is like, they're pretty clear usually about putting forward their opinion, or at least they appear to be. Like it was really looking at the Middle East first, where they're just sort of like, the Islamic State is everywhere, like they are very pro-militarist. They're they're still fighting the Cold War. But they at least talk about the world. And like for a guy growing up in the United States, like that's still, a tremendously exciting thing. So yeah, I mean, The Economist is, actively making the world worse, but I will always have a very soft spot for it because, even as they actively make the world worse, they're trying to describe it, like trying to understand it, which is more that can be said for, well, honestly, a lot of U.S. news organizations. So, okay. Local Extreme says, not knowing much about India, ASEAN, and Africa, I can forgive, but not knowing much about your own backyard hemisphere, to quote Stephen A. Smith, blasphemous. Well, it's true. I am a blasphemer. I'm very conscious that I don't know enough about Latin America, and I am, especially if I'm going to do this U.S. empire project that I am working on. I've got a whiteboard up. I've got, outlining stuff. It's exciting. Especially if I'm going to do that, I need to know a lot more about Latin America. So I'm working on it, man. I got just finished the Grandin book, which is good oversight. And where's my Guatemala book? Where did I put it? Oh yeah, my Guatemala book is under the reading a book in Guatemala. It's slowly. Logo, I eventually intend to understand everything, but it's going to take some time. All right. Questions. Do we have any questions? We're talking about birth rates, huh? Man. Okay. Got questions. Brazil, rise up like Mexico did. We need you. Let's see. Monsanto's German now. They are in Axis of Evil. So nobody's got any questions? I mean, okay. Hamza Tariq says, I remember you making videos about what your next project will be. Will you eventually get to South Asia conflicts, e.g. Pakistan, India, Afghanistan? Well, Hamza, I intend to do this project for the rest of my life. And if I am able to do this project for the rest of my life and, I eat a little less and the rest of my life is in my 60s and 70s instead of in my 50s, then yeah, I fully intend to get to South Asia, Pakistan, India, Afghanistan. But I'm not there yet. There's a lot more reading that I have to do. What I'm doing, like this year, my focuses are sort of U.S. empire, which does, I mean, obviously I'm going to have to read it, probably go back and read Ghost Wars again, Steve Cole's books on the U.S. and Afghanistan, both before 9/11 and after 9/11. He did Ghost Wars, and then he did a follow-up book. I have read Ghost Wars. I have not read the follow-up book. I probably need to reread both of those. But I'm not going to really be able to do in-depth. For in-depth, what I want to do is I think this year, beyond the U.S. empire stuff, is I really want to get into the Horn of Africa, both because there's a horrifying civil war going on in Ethiopia right now, but also because Sudan has always been really fascinating to me. And I think there's a potential of a real democratic transition in Sudan. And it's just such a fascinating mix of, it's Arab, but it's African, but there's so much going on there. So yeah, I'm probably mostly focusing on U.S. effects in places, and I can't really speak appropriately to Pakistan, India, Afghanistan if I'm just focusing on what the U.S. is doing there. I mean, these are real, very significant places with their own power dynamics that trying to get a sense of, but. When I'm not the economist here. I'm not just running around the world imposing my views on things. I want to try to actually understand things. So in order to do that, I can't really tackle India and Pakistan yet. But within the next decade or so, I hope. Call Me Papa says, I expect Pakistani propaganda points. It's quite possible. Who knows? I do like Muslims. The More Freedom Foundation, the Sunny 3333 says, what do you think of the recent events in Morocco? Plus Israel, USA, recolonization versus Algeria. It's funny because I made a video about Western Sahara, Morocco, Western Sahara, and Algeria about 2 years ago, making the point that it just really I hate this conflict because it just makes me so angry that Morocco and Algeria aren't better partners, because if Morocco and Algeria were better partners, God, the great thing is wow, what if Morocco and Algeria and democratic Tunisia and a democratic Libya, all were working together? It would be amazing. But for some reason, Morocco and Algeria have spent the past 3 fucking decades fighting over literally a patch of dust. Called Western Sahara. So it is my least favorite topic. I made a video about it, mostly talking about how dumb it is that we're all focused on Western Sahara. And of course, the Trump administration dramatically shifted US policy on Western Sahara. So I should probably have made a video about it 4 or 5 months ago, but it just makes me so angry that I just don't want to learn anything more about it. So yeah. I'm sure that's an unsatisfying answer, Sonny, but yeah, so what happened was that the international community has long recognized Western Sahara as independent and occupied by Morocco since the 70s or so. Algeria has supported Polisario, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, which controls almost none of the Western Sahara territory anymore, but has decently well-funded and armed refugee camps in the bottom of sort of Algeria, which is adjoining Western Sahara. The Trump administration, in return for a largely meaningless deal between Morocco and Israel, decided to recognize that Western Sahara was part of Morocco, pissing off all manner of people, including James A. Baker, which is kind of amazing. And James Baker, who's the first Bush's Secretary of State, largely credited along with the first Bush as sort of helping end the Cold War, just being oh my, and also an extremely conservative guy who voted for Trump multiple times, just putting together this oh my God, I can't believe we're screwing up Morocco policy this much. So I don't know. It seems like Algeria at this point is honestly too much on its ass to retaliate to Morocco over Western Sahara in a meaningful way, and that could be the best result possible. Yeah, I don't know. So yeah, that's as much as I'm going to say about Western Sahara. Hate that conflict. So stupid. Call Me Papa says, what do you think about CPEC? And if you're not able to talk about it, what do you think the future of Taiwan is for the next 20 years? Is CPEC, is that the China's TPP? Is that what CPEC is? What do I think of CPEC? I haven't really thought about it much, honestly. I think it's very significant that the Trump administration ended with China signing, sort of a Chinese version of the TPP and a Chinese version of a big economic deal with Europe, which were two things that Trump very, very dramatically refused to do. But I think that both of those agreements, I suspect that both of those agreements, while they do have real weight and value and meaning, I think they're both less weighty and meaningful than the TPP or the TTIP would have been. Those are the versions of Pacific and European trade deals that Trump abandoned. So yeah, I just don't know. I have not read the CPEC. I don't know what the actual minutiae are. So yeah, can't speak to that. But there's something about Taiwan you wanted to know. Yeah, Taiwan's really interesting. I do have to say about Taiwan, the one main thing is people are just flipping out. China's going to invade Taiwan. China did this airspace. China did this. If China was in a position right now to invade Taiwan, it would have done so between January 6th and January 20th of this year, when the United States basically didn't have a president. So yeah, I am not worried about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan in the short term. In the medium term, if the United States continues on its path of ridiculous belligerence, China does nasty shit in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, but these are things that happen within Chinese borders. And the United States has managed to completely discredit the idea that human rights should trump sovereignty over the past 20 years. By making such a murderous mismatch of Iraq, Syria, and Libya. So yeah, I don't think anybody's really interested in the world beyond hearing about how China's mean to people in its own areas. Yeah, it is U.S. aggression that is trying to bring about a Cold War, and if that continues along certain pathways for the next 5 to 10 years, then yes. Absolutely, Taiwan is in danger of a Chinese invasion, and that's really shitty. So yeah. Okay. Questions. Do we have questions? No questions. No super chats. Where's Brando Commando? He's always very generous. Anyway. Questions. Kosiku says, why does the West support Uyghurs but the Turkey don't? There's a whole section of Istanbul that's mostly Uyghur, great Uyghur food. Yeah, I don't think it's quite been established that there's been a lot of talk about how Turkey is deporting Uyghurs to China and this, that, and the other thing, but I haven't seen so much of it yet. Maybe that's a thing that happens. Yeah, I think it's been pretty impressive, or not impressive, surprising, just how little most Muslim countries want to step up for the Uyghurs. Mostly because they want money from China, and also. Most of those countries are sort of run by somewhat repressive dictatorships. Not Turkey. I would not put Turkey in that position yet. Though, actually, I would put Turkey in this position, which is that they've all got their own insurgencies that they are interested in crushing. So they're less full of give a shit about China, how China governs its Muslims. But yeah, it is surprising because Turkey, has historically been the home of the Uyghur diaspora, the East Turkestan independence movement. Its home is Istanbul, and yeah, Turkey's not really doing much for them, and that's a shame. But not that surprising, honestly. Yeah, I think a lot of the world cares a lot more about sovereignty, the ability for a country to control its own borders than the United States does. The United States doesn't care about sovereignty because our sovereignty hasn't been in any kind of dispute at all since 1812. I guess 1941 briefly, but the Japanese didn't even try to take Pearl Harbor. So this really bedrock principle of international law is something the United States is not really that interested in because we know that our sovereignty is, it can't be violated, at least not in the current, state of affairs. And we put a lot of effort into selling this idea that human rights are more important than sovereignty. And that's why we're gonna invade Iraq, or we're gonna destabilize Syria, or we're gonna invade Libya. And every single fucking time we've invaded a country because human rights are more important than sovereignty, we have created obscene death and destruction. So the fact that the world community isn't that interested in, I don't know, attempting to destabilize one of the most wealthy and powerful nuclear powers in the world, I don't think should be that surprising. Maybe I think people are a little overly dramatized how surprising it should be. Local Extreme says, so what are the chances Chauvin is acquitted in the George Floyd trial? I don't know, man. I would think they were pretty fucking low, but it's amazing how much the U.S. criminal justice system can disappoint you. The U.S. So Derek Chauvin is the guy who famously launched really, I almost feel like the country's only ever the country's first nationwide protest movement. The Minneapolis police officer who kneeled on George Floyd's neck, killing him, and was filmed doing so. So the U.S. Criminal justice system is tremendously biased towards police officers, not just in terms of sort of corruption. The prosecutors know the cops and don't want to prosecute them, but also just statutorily. I mean, we have concepts like qualified immunity and others that basically mean that it's very hard for a police officer to be prosecuted for killing somebody on the job. But I do feel like no matter how much we like to pretend it's not, the law is always political in its outcomes, and I do feel like it'd be very surprising if Chauvin walked free. Is he going to be convicted of murder? Probably not, actually. But there's going to be lesser charges I assume there are lesser charges of manslaughter that he's definitely going to be convicted of and serve for a couple of years. But yeah, it would just be, I can't imagine anything stupider than that jury or that court sending Chauvin out for free, setting him free. Though honestly, I mean, Trump's not president anymore. Are people going to care as much? I don't know. Thoughts? Alan asks, thoughts on Libya's first female foreign minister? I did not know that Libya had a female foreign minister. That's cool. Cool. I think that's all I have to say about that. Danny Yegg says, I'm sorry, the super chat. I guess I should think more about that. Yeah, I mean, I'm more interested in Libya, having a working government than getting feminism points. But I'm happy to hear it. Sounds good. God, didn't Saudi Arabia briefly have a female minister to the United States, or am I thinking of something else? But yeah, I mean that's cool. Denny Egg says, "What do you think about the upcoming Iranian election, and what would be the impact on the JCPOA?" Honestly, I think the next president is going to adapt the same position as Rouhani, regardless. That's interesting, Denny Egg. Yeah, I think that there's a big assumption that some hardliner is going to win the next election, which is true, I think. And then the JCPOA is never going to happen. I think I've probably pushed that idea as well, and I think you're probably wrong about that. I think you're probably right. I think the hardliner is still going to have the same incentives and might actually have more power over the IGRC and sort of might be actually better suited to manage escalation and whatnot in ways that make the JCPOA possible. I mean, it's possibly optimistic. It's also possibly pessimistic. I've listened to a podcast or two on the Iranian election, and I don't know. Other than the fact that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is just freaking hilarious, I don't know what to say. Ahmadinejad was a famous hate figure in the United States. He was the big scary Iran guy, I think, during the Bush years and the early Obama years. Famously, he was sort of fraudulently reelected, prompting one of the most destabilizing movements in the Iranian theocracy's history in 2009. But now, apparently, that he's been out of power, he's like billing himself as against everybody, and he's running for president again, and I don't know, it's pretty funny if you're familiar with Ahmadinejad's long-term history. I mean, he's got an English language Twitter account where he's tweeting about University of Michigan football games, which is kind of funny. Yeah, it's a weird thing. Iranian elections. All right. So it's been almost 2 hours. I think at this point I'm going to start pitching, and then if anybody super chats, then I will answer that question. I think it's time to spiel. My name is Robert Morris. Every Tuesday, without fail, since March of 2014, I have uploaded a video on some aspect of geopolitics or U.S. politics, just politics or history. You can find those videos by subscribing here. Please subscribe and hit the bell that allows you to get notifications, because if you just subscribe, you'll never hear about it. I can be found on Twitter at RoboLaw. That's at RoboLaw. Just put that in the chat. That's me on Twitter, where the conversation continues all week. I spend too much time on Twitter, as I'm joined by many of the folks on this chat, where we discuss everything and sundry. Join me there. You can follow me on Instagram at The Golden Age. I'm trying to use Instagram more as a promotional thing, so I can always use more followers over there. That's at The Golden Age on Instagram. Let's see. What else? Yes, I've written books. I've written a very long book called Avoiding the British Empire that I would recommend highly. It is, about how the U.S. is making the same mistakes, and it sort of just describes what the British Empire was, because it's not exactly what most people think it was. It's a very nice, long, thick book. If you want a shorter book, I've got Everybody's Lying About Islam, which talks about the U.S.-Saudi relationship and how that's at the root of this whole sort of terrorism thing that is, mostly an afterthought and people are forgetting about it now. But if you want to, for historical interest, you can read this. And then there's Fatka and the New Birth of American Empire, probably the most technical of the things that I've written. It's the shortest, but would probably take you the longest to read and understand. But it actually is worth understanding. I talk a lot about how U.S. empire is much more about legal concepts and finance and banking than it is about gunships or the Department of Defense. And that really sort of gets into the weeds in a way that you might find interesting. You can find all of those on Amazon or in the description of videos other than this one, where I'm being less lazy. I would also like to encourage you highly to sign up for my email list. I've started doing sort of monthly newsletters, which is basically just a video script I don't perform. It's usually talking about something at some length with some links and stuff. The email link can be found on the YouTube channel. You can also find my email. If someone wants my email address, you can find it there. Malta Meyer says Avoiding the British Empire is a good read. I agree. You should read it. And finally, if you enjoyed this live chat format, you might also want to sign up for my crowdfunding thing on Patreon. I do 2 live chats a month. One of them is public for everybody, like here, and one of them is for the patrons only. It's the patrons only newscast, where instead of doing one big topic, I put together a list of like a dozen topics. some of them I come up with, a lot of them patrons come up with, and I sort of do little bits of research on each of those topics, and we go through and discuss that list. There's only usually about 5 or 10 people who participate in that live chat live, so like every comment gets dealt with, every question gets answered. It's really more of a discussion. It's a lot of fun. The next one's coming up on April 10th. So if you want to participate in that, you got to sign up for my crowdfunding thing on Patreon. It's what we call incentives, folks. All right. Thank you so much for being here. I'm sorry this one was a little late. And I'm happy to say I am getting vaccinated this afternoon. So, if there's a Bill Gates microchip or, heart exploding side effects, this could be my last, video. But I don't think either of those things are going to happen. I'm getting vaccinated. I would encourage all of you to get vaccinated. And because I'm ready for the roaring 20s, aren't you? Anyway, thank you all so much. Y'all are the best. And you are the More Freedom Foundation. And with that, I'm ending the stream. End.